Mississippi, 1853 was not a place where cruelty needed to disguise itself as chaos. It functioned best when it looked orderly. The fields were measured, the workdays predictable, and the violence regulated enough to feel ordinary. Men collapsed there not because anyone lost control, but because control was applied without pause. Elijah Brewer understood this distinction early, and he shaped his entire operation around it. Brewer did not arrive in Mississippi as a reckless man chasing fortune. He arrived as someone who believed the system could be improved. He had spent years observing other planters, noting where they failed. Too much anger, too much impulsive punishment, too many dead bodies too quickly. In Brewer's mind, that was waste. A dead man produced nothing. A living man, even a broken one, could still be made useful. The goal was not pain. The goal was exhaustion that never fully lifted. He was in his early 40s when he began his major expansion in 1853, an age where patience felt like wisdom rather than delay. He carried himself carefully. His clothes were plain but clean. His speech was controlled, rarely rising in volume. He understood that reputation mattered more than confession. Men who shouted drew attention. Men who whispered got away with more. Brewer attended church regularly and sat where he could be seen without appearing important. He listened to sermons about order, obedience, and God's design with the same focus he gave to his ledgers. He believed deeply in hierarchy. Some men were meant to command. Others were meant to endure. That belief did not feel cruel to him. It felt natural, almost comforting, because it removed responsibility. If suffering was ordained, then managing it efficiently became a virtue. When Brewer entered the slave markets that spring, he did so with intent already formed. He was not interested in emotional displays or dramatic bidding wars. He watched quietly as men were brought forward, stripped of dignity long before they were stripped of clothing. Brewer studied their bodies, the way a craftsman studies raw material. He looked for signs of previous labor rather than untouched strength. Scarred hands mattered more than youth. Calm eyes mattered more than obedience. He believed a man who had already endured hardship without collapsing was more valuable than one who had never been tested. He paid close attention to breathing, to how chests expanded under strain, to how long a man could stand still without shifting his weight. These were not instincts. They were habits formed through years of watching bodies fail. Brewer bought men in deliberate numbers, often returning multiple times rather than purchasing in bulk. He avoided families. Children were a burden. Women were purchased only when logistics demanded it, never as part of his core labor force. His plantation was not designed to sustain life beyond usefulness. It was designed to extract everything first. The land he expanded that year lay close to the river, fertile and heavy. Cotton thrived there, but only under constant pressure. The work demanded repetition so exact that the body began to move without thought. Brewer intensified this rhythm until fatigue became permanent. Days began before sunrise, when muscles were still stiff and minds unfocused. Work continued long after strength should have been spent. Darkness, not mercy, ended most days. Meals were calculated with precision. Brewer believed hunger was one of the most reliable tools of control. A man who was never fully fed remained quiet. His thoughts slowed. His resistance dulled. Food was provided just generously enough to prevent immediate death, never enough to allow recovery. Sleep followed the same logic. Men were given rest only in fragments, interrupted by preparation and expectation. Illness was treated as inconvenience unless it threatened the group's output. A coughing man was ignored. A limping man was pushed harder. Brewer believed weakness revealed itself under pressure, and revealing weakness was useful. Overseers were instructed to report decline, not prevent it. Their job was to maintain pace, not mercy. Brewer selected overseers carefully. He did not want men who enjoyed cruelty openly. Sadism attracted attention. He wanted men who followed instruction precisely, who punished without emotion, who understood that efficiency mattered more than expression. Whippings were allowed but regulated. Public spectacle was discouraged. Pain was most effective when it felt routine. Brewer kept detailed records far beyond what was required. Production totals mattered, but so did physical deterioration. He noted when posture bent permanently, when hands shook during simple tasks, when breathing grew shallow after work that once seemed manageable. These details fascinated him. They felt like evidence of mastery, proof that his system was superior. The first collapses came quietly. A man fell while lifting and could not stand again. Another sat down during a brief pause and never rose. There were no dramatic scenes. Overseers dragged bodies aside so work could continue. Brewer was informed later, usually in the evening when numbers were reviewed. He made notes without visible reaction. Deaths followed in the same manner. Some men lingered for days, unable to work but not allowed to rest. Others were removed and replaced without comment. Brewer told himself this was not cruelty. It was inevitability. Bodies had limits. He was simply finding them more efficiently than others. Neighbors noticed increased output and said nothing else. Cotton moved steadily downriver. Brewer's accounts grew. His reputation strengthened. Men admired his discipline and envied his results. No one asked where the missing laborers went. No one counted the graves. Silence became part of the system. Brewer believed he was building something permanent. He believed control was proof of intelligence, and endurance was proof of worth. He did not see the irony forming quietly beneath his certainty. He did not yet understand that the same calculations he applied to other bodies would one day be applied to his own without mercy, when strength faded and efficiency turned against him. For now he watched men collapse and convinced himself it meant success. By late summer of 1853, the plantation had settled into its true rhythm. What had begun as expansion became routine, and routine made cruelty easier to ignore. The fields no longer felt temporary or experimental. They felt established, as if they had always existed this way. Elijah Brewer believed this was the moment when a system proved itself, when suffering stopped feeling like an act and began to feel like a law of nature. Brewer adjusted his operations subtly, the way a man fine-tunes a machine after watching it run. He shortened rest periods by minutes rather than hours. He extended workdays incrementally, never enough at once to provoke open resistance. Men adapted because they had no choice, and adaptation became its own trap. Each small increase in demand made the next one easier to justify. Brewer told himself he was merely responding to what the men had already proven they could endure. The overseers learned quickly what he expected. Reports became more detailed. They stopped describing pain and began describing performance. A man was no longer said to be suffering. He was slowing. Another was not injured. He was inefficient. Language shifted first and behavior followed. Brewer encouraged this without ever stating it directly. Precision in words led to precision in control. Punishment grew more frequent, though not more visible. Whippings happened at dawn or late evening, away from the fields. The sound rarely carried far. Brewer did not attend these punishments. He believed presence contaminated objectivity. Pain in his mind was a corrective measure, not a spectacle. The real discipline remained exhaustion, hunger, and fear of replacement. Replacement became easier as the months passed. Brewer had established relationships with traders who knew exactly what he wanted. Strong men, no questions. No expectations of longevity. When a body failed completely, another arrived within days. The transition was seamless. The work never paused long enough to acknowledge absence. Men learned quickly that collapse did not bring relief. Those who fell were not cared for. They were not given time to recover. They were dragged aside, left in the heat, sometimes ordered back to work once they could stand again. Those who could not were removed quietly. Survival required constant motion, even when motion caused damage. Brewer watched these patterns with interest. He believed fear was most effective when paired with predictability. The men knew what would happen if they slowed. They knew what would happen if they fell. There were no surprises, and that certainty crushed hope more effectively than random violence ever could. Illness spread easily under these conditions. Fevers moved through the quarters. Infections went untreated. Brewer refused to involve doctors unless an entire group was affected. He believed medical intervention weakened discipline. Pain untreated taught obedience. A man who expected no help learned to rely only on himself, and self-reliance under captivity turned inward, becoming resignation. The quarters themselves reflected Brewer's philosophy. They were functional, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Comfort was not a consideration. Cleanliness was enforced only to the extent that disease threatened productivity. Privacy did not exist. Fatigue ensured compliance. At night, men slept deeply when they slept at all, bodies shutting down faster than minds could process what had happened during the day. Brewer's ledgers grew thicker. He recorded productivity increases with satisfaction. Output justified everything. Each successful season confirmed his belief that mercy was inefficient and unnecessary. He compared his results with neighboring plantations and found his numbers superior. This comparison pleased him more than profit. It felt like validation. Neighbors began to imitate aspects of his system. Shorter breaks, tighter schedules, more aggressive replacement. Brewer noticed this with quiet pride. Influence to him was proof of correctness. He believed he was refining a model others had been using carelessly for years. The suffering of men became secondary to the elegance of the method. As the year progressed, resistance appeared in small, desperate forms. Tools were damaged. Rows were worked poorly when overseers turned away. A few men attempted escape, though none succeeded. Brewer responded with predictability. Punishment followed swiftly and impersonally. Those who resisted were made examples of, not through spectacle but through absence. They disappeared and work continued. Fear deepened. Silence thickened. Men stopped speaking openly even at night. Brewer interpreted this as success. A quiet workforce was an efficient one. He did not understand that silence also meant something else, something dangerous. It meant nothing remained to lose. The first death that unsettled Brewer occurred without drama. A man collapsed during work and did not wake again. No struggle, no visible injury, just failure. Brewer reviewed the circumstances carefully. He adjusted nothing. The system, he concluded, was functioning within acceptable limits. But death began arriving more frequently after that. Bodies failed faster, as exhaustion accumulated across months rather than days. Replacement kept numbers steady, but experience was lost. Brewer noticed this in subtle declines in coordination and timing. New men took longer to learn the rhythm. Output remained high, but effort increased. Brewer responded by tightening control further. He increased oversight. He demanded stricter adherence to schedule. He believed inefficiency could always be corrected with pressure. He did not consider the possibility that pressure itself was the cause. By the end of the year, the plantation operated at a pace that few could sustain for long. Brewer saw this as proof of strength. Others saw it as excess. Rumors reached nearby towns, but no formal complaints followed. The law did not ask questions it did not want answered. Brewer stood at the edge of his fields one evening. Watching men move in practiced exhaustion, he felt satisfied. The system held. The profits justified the means. He believed he had solved a problem others had failed to master. What he did not see or refused to see was the cost accumulating quietly, not just in bodies, but in the fragile balance that kept the system intact. The same predictability that enforced obedience was beginning to erase fear. And when fear disappeared, something far more dangerous took its place. By the beginning of 1854, the plantation no longer felt new, even to the men who had been brought there only months earlier. Time blurred under repetition, days stacked on top of one another without distinction, each one demanding the same movements, the same silence, the same surrender of strength. Elisha Brewer saw this uniformity as progress. To him, sameness meant control had been perfected. Brewer expanded again, not outward but inward. He demanded more from the same space, the same soil, the same bodies. Rows were planted closer together. Tasks that had once been separated were combined. Men were expected to lift, carry, and pick without pause. Brewer believed efficiency was born when transitions disappeared, when the body moved continuously without the mind interrupting. The overseers adapted to this new expectation. They stopped waiting for signs of failure and began anticipating them. Men who looked tired were pushed harder. Brewer believed fatigue revealed potential. If a man could still move while exhausted, then exhaustion was not yet a limit. This logic became self-reinforcing. Every time a man continued working past visible strain, Brewer saw confirmation of his beliefs. Punishment shifted in tone rather than intensity. Whippings remained controlled, but threats became more specific. Men were told exactly what would happen if they slowed. Removal, replacement, disappearance. Brewer did not need to invent fear. He only needed to maintain it. The knowledge that collapse did not bring relief became more powerful than any blow. Food rations were adjusted again, slightly smaller, slightly later, never enough to provoke immediate revolt, but enough to deepen weakness. Brewer told himself the men were adapting. In reality, they were deteriorating. Weight dropped. Muscles hardened without strength. Injuries healed incorrectly or not at all. Brewer noted these changes without emotion. Illness became constant. Fevers lingered. Wounds festered. Coughs deepened into something permanent. Brewer allowed a doctor to visit once, briefly, when several men collapsed within days of each other. The visit was purely transactional. The doctor confirmed what Brewer already knew: exhaustion, infection, nothing unusual under the circumstances. Brewer dismissed him and returned to his ledgers. The quarters grew quieter at night. Men spoke less, even among themselves. Energy was conserved for survival. Those who still talked did so in fragments, short warnings and observations rather than stories. Hope required imagination, and imagination required strength. Brewer mistook this silence for obedience. He believed fear had fully replaced resistance. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The men had begun measuring time differently. They no longer thought in terms of escape or rescue. They thought in terms of endurance. How many more days the body could last? How much pain could be absorbed before collapse? Survival became a private calculation, repeated silently with each breath. Brewer noticed that men stopped begging. Early on there had been pleas for rest, for food, for mercy. Now there were none. Orders were followed without argument. Mistakes were corrected quickly. The system appeared flawless. Brewer felt vindicated. He believed he had removed inefficiency entirely. He did not notice that obedience without hope carried a different risk. Men who expected nothing had nothing to protect. A body pushed beyond fear no longer responded to threats. Brewer's system relied on predictability, but predictability worked both ways. The men learned exactly how far they could be pushed before collapse. Some began to choose collapse deliberately. The first deliberate failure was subtle. A man slowed just enough to draw attention. Punishment followed. He accepted it without resistance. Days later, he collapsed and did not recover. Brewer recorded it as expected attrition. He did not see intention where there was none in his worldview. He believed all actions were responses to pressure, never choices. As months passed, these collapses became more frequent, not sudden, not dramatic. Men worked until their bodies simply shut down. Brewer replaced them efficiently, but something changed. New men arrived already aware. They had heard stories. They understood the pace. Fear existed, but so did resignation. Brewer mistook resignation for compliance. The financial results remained strong. Cotton yields impressed neighboring planters. Brewer's methods were discussed quietly, sometimes admired, sometimes criticized in vague terms. No one challenged him openly. Profit protected him. The law remained uninterested. Brewer himself changed little on the surface. He remained controlled, measured, confident. But age had begun to assert itself in small ways. He felt stiffness in the mornings. Fatigue lingered longer than it once had. He dismissed these sensations as trivial. He believed discipline applied equally to all bodies, including his own. He did not yet connect his discomfort to the suffering he engineered daily. He believed himself exempt not by law but by intelligence. He managed exhaustion. He did not submit to it. That distinction comforted him. One evening, as he reviewed his ledgers, Brewer noticed a pattern he had not anticipated. Replacement rates were increasing. Men were failing faster than before. The system required more input to maintain the same output. He adjusted figures, recalculated expectations, and moved on. He told himself this was normal. Bodies wore out. That was their purpose. What he did not consider was that systems built on constant depletion eventually consume themselves. Each adjustment tightened pressure further, accelerating decline. Brewer had built a machine that could not slow down without collapsing. For now he continued refining it, confident that control was permanent. He did not realize that permanence was an illusion, and that the consequences of his precision were already forming. quietly, inside both the fields and his own aging body. By the time 1855 arrived, Elijah Brewer no longer thought of his plantation as a place. It had become a process. Fields, quarters, bodies, and schedules blended into a single mechanism that ran whether he watched it or not. This pleased him. A system that required constant supervision was weak. A system that enforced itself was proof of success. Brewer spent less time in the fields now. He did not need to be present to feel in control. Reports came to him daily, delivered in the language he had trained his overseers to use. Numbers, output, replacement, delay, collapse, death was rarely mentioned directly. It appeared only as absence, as a line that stopped being filled and was quietly replaced by another. The men understood this language too, even if they never spoke it aloud. They learned that once a body failed completely, it vanished from the system. There were no rituals, no acknowledgements, no pauses in work. One man disappeared, another took his place, and the rows continued moving. This understanding changed how they thought about survival. Living longer did not mean living better. It only meant enduring more. Brewer noticed that the men no longer reacted to punishment the way they once had. Early in his operation, pain had produced visible fear. Now it produced silence. Faces did not change. Bodies absorbed blows without protest. Brewer interpreted this as progress. He believed fear had been fully internalized. He did not understand that fear had begun to lose its power. When fear faded, Brewer relied more heavily on routine. Schedules tightened further. Deviations were punished automatically without discussion. The plantation ran on expectation rather than command. Men rose before being told. They moved when signaled. They stopped only when their bodies refused. Brewer admired this efficiency. He believed he had removed unpredictability entirely. But unpredictability had not disappeared. It had merely shifted location. It lived now inside exhausted bodies that no longer responded reliably. Men fainted without warning. Tools slipped from hands that could no longer grip. Steps faltered on ground they had crossed 1,000 times. Each failure forced the system to adjust again. Brewer responded the only way he knew how, by increasing pressure. He ordered overseers to watch more closely, to intervene sooner, to punish hesitation before it became delay. This created a feedback loop. Increased oversight increased stress. Increased stress accelerated collapse. Brewer recorded the changes, but refused to question the underlying logic. The financial results remained strong, but the margins narrowed. Replacement costs rose. New men required time to learn the rhythm, even when beaten into compliance quickly. Brewer noticed inefficiencies creeping in, not because of mercy, but because of exhaustion spread across the entire operation. The machine demanded more fuel to maintain the same pace. Outside the plantation, whispers grew more distinct. Traders spoke quietly about conditions. A few planters avoided adopting Brewer's methods fully, citing long-term risk. Brewer dismissed them as sentimental or incompetent. He believed only weak men worried about sustainability. Strong systems consumed resources until nothing remained. And that to him was proof of success. Brewer's own body began to betray him in ways he could not easily dismiss. His hands stiffened in the mornings. His breathing felt shallow after long walks. Sleep did not restore him as it once had. He noticed these changes with irritation rather than fear. Aging, he told himself, was an inconvenience, not a verdict. Discipline would correct it. He adjusted his own routine as he adjusted everything else. He woke earlier. He rested less. He forced his body to comply with expectation. When pain appeared, he ignored it. When fatigue lingered, he pushed through it. He believed this proved superiority. He was not like the men he owned. He commanded his limits. What he failed to recognize was how closely his thinking now mirrored the logic he applied to others. He treated his own body as a resource to be extracted from, not a system that required care. He believed endurance was moral and collapse was failure. This belief hardened as his discomfort increased. Meanwhile, the men sensed change, even if they could not name it. Brewer appeared less often, and when he did, his presence carried tension rather than confidence. Orders came faster. Patience shortened. The system felt strained. Men did not hope for improvement. They prepared for acceleration. Small acts of defiance emerged again, quieter than before. Tools were mishandled. Steps slowed fractionally. Errors multiplied just enough to draw punishment. Brewer responded predictably. Punishment intensified and replacement followed. The cycle tightened. One evening, an overseer reported something unusual. A man had collapsed and died without warning, leaving no time to remove him from the fields. Work had stopped briefly. Brewer was irritated by the interruption more than the death. He reprimanded the overseer for failing to anticipate weakness. He did not consider that anticipation was becoming impossible. Brewer returned to his ledgers and noticed a trend he could no longer ignore. Lifespans on his plantation were shortening. Men were failing faster, even those who appeared strong at purchase. The system was consuming bodies at an accelerating rate. Brewer recalculated again, tightening schedules further to compensate. He told himself this was temporary. That efficiency would stabilize once adjustments settled. He had invested too much to question the foundation now. Questioning would imply doubt, and doubt threatened identity. Brewer had built his sense of worth on control. Losing control was unthinkable. As 1855 drew toward its end, the plantation continued operating at a pace that defied endurance. Brewer stood at the edge of his fields less often now, watching from a distance when he watched at all. The machine ran, but it no longer felt effortless. It demanded constant correction. What Brewer did not yet accept was that he had crossed a threshold. The system he built could no longer slow without collapsing, and neither could he. The same logic that had stripped mercy from others had begun stripping resilience from him. The reckoning was not immediate, but it was inevitable, and it was already underway. By 1856, the plantation no longer expanded. It consumed. What Brewer had once called growth now revealed itself as maintenance. An endless effort to keep collapse from becoming visible. The machine still ran, but only because more bodies were fed into it at a faster rate. Brewer noticed this clearly, even if he refused to name it honestly. Replacement shipments arrived more frequently. The men who came were different now. They arrived thinner, more cautious, already carrying the knowledge that this place shortened lives. They learned quickly because they had to. There was no gradual adjustment anymore. The pace allowed no learning curve. Those who could not adapt immediately disappeared just as quickly. Brewer responded by narrowing his expectations. He no longer imagined long usefulness. He calculated in seasons rather than years. This shift did not trouble him as much as it should have. In his mind, it was simply another refinement. Bodies wore out faster under pressure. That was not a failure of design. It was proof of maximum extraction. The overseers grew harsher without being instructed to do so. They felt the strain themselves. Brewer's tolerance for delay had vanished. Reports were scrutinized more aggressively. Any deviation was treated as incompetence. Fear flowed downward through the hierarchy, tightening behavior at every level. The plantation felt brittle, stretched thin by its own efficiency. The men sensed this brittleness instinctively. They understood when a system was desperate. Punishments felt less corrective and more frantic. Orders came faster, sharper, without the calm certainty that had once defined Brewer's rule. The predictability that had crushed hope now began to crack. Illness moved through the quarters unchecked. Brewer refused to slow operations, even when fevers took entire groups out of rotation. He calculated losses and compensated by extending hours for those still standing. Rest vanished almost entirely. Sleep became an interruption rather than a recovery. Men worked in a state of permanent depletion. Deaths increased, not dramatically but steadily. Brewer no longer reviewed each case in detail. He skimmed reports, noting totals rather than circumstances. The ledger became less precise, more crowded. What once felt like mastery now felt like chasing. Numbers that refused to stay contained. Brewer's own health deteriorated more visibly. His hands shook when writing for long periods. He experienced sudden breathlessness that forced him to pause mid-step. He dismissed these episodes as temporary weakness, signs that discipline needed to be reapplied. He doubled down on his routines, waking earlier, resting less, forcing his body to comply. The irony escaped him completely. He treated himself exactly as he treated the men he owned. Fatigue was ignored. Pain was treated as a challenge. Collapse, when it came, was framed as moral failure. Brewer believed he could command his body the way he commanded others. He did not consider that command had limits. Neighbors noticed his decline. A few remarked on his appearance, the weight loss, the pallor. Brewer waved off concern. He believed sympathy was a form of condescension. He had built his identity on control. Admitting vulnerability would undermine everything he had proven. Meanwhile, discipline among the men began to erode in subtle ways. Not rebellion, but disengagement. Work continued, but without precision. Mistakes multiplied. Tools broke more often. Timing slipped. Brewer responded with punishment and replacement. But the corrections no longer produced improvement. The system resisted refinement. One incident in late summer unsettled even Brewer. An overseer collapsed while enforcing punishment. The man had been working extended hours himself, driven by Brewer's expectations. The collapse disrupted operations for an entire day. Brewer was furious, not because a man had nearly died, but because the chain of control had been interrupted. That evening, Brewer sat alone reviewing his accounts and felt something unfamiliar. Not doubt, but irritation mixed with unease. The numbers no longer reassured him. They fluctuated too quickly. Costs rose faster than profits. The margin that had once justified everything thinned. He considered reducing pace briefly, not out of mercy, but to stabilize output. The thought disturbed him. Slowing down felt like surrender. He dismissed it immediately and increased pressure instead. He had never believed in retreat. Retreat implied limits, and limits threatened his worldview. The men felt the acceleration immediately. Hours lengthened again. Breaks shortened further. Punishments intensified in frequency, if not spectacle. Bodies responded predictably. Collapse followed collapse. Replacement struggled to keep up. The fields began to feel haunted by absence. Crows worked by faces that changed constantly. Brewer stopped walking the fields altogether. He watched from a distance now, often seated. Conserving energy he pretended he did not lack. Orders were delivered through intermediaries. His physical absence weakened authority in ways he did not anticipate. Control felt abstract, less immediate. At night, Brewer slept poorly. Pain woke him. Breathlessness startled him awake. He lay still, listening to his own body the way he once listened to reports of failing men. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself discipline would restore order. He believed this because the alternative was unthinkable. By the end of 1856, the plantation still functioned, but barely. It produced, but at a cost that no longer felt manageable. Brewer stood at the center of a system that demanded constant sacrifice, including his own. The machine he had perfected no longer distinguished between those it consumed and those who commanded it. What Brewer did not yet admit was that the logic he had, enforced so relentlessly, was now turning inward. The same refusal to rest, the same denial of limits, the same contempt for weakness had begun to govern his own decline. The punishment he had normalized was no longer distant. It was becoming personal. By 1857, Elijah Brewer could no longer pretend that time was neutral. It pressed against him in the same way it pressed against the men in his fields, steadily and without sympathy. The difference he once believed existed between command and submission had narrowed to something almost invisible. His authority remained on paper, but his body had begun to renegotiate its terms without asking permission. Brewer reduced his presence further, not by decision but by necessity. Walking the length of the fields exhausted him. Standing for extended periods left him lightheaded. He blamed inefficiency in others, weather, noise, anything that allowed him to avoid the simplest conclusion. The body, when pushed long enough, always collected its debt. He had believed intelligence could exempt him. It could not. The overseers sensed the shift immediately. Orders came second-hand, filtered through messengers who lacked Brewer's authority. Enforcement grew inconsistent. Some overseers compensated with brutality. Others hesitated, uncertain how far to go without direct instruction. The system that once enforced itself now depended on men who were afraid of making mistakes. Fear replaced clarity, and clarity had been the true engine of control. Among the enslaved men, awareness sharpened. They noticed Brewer's absence. They noticed the delays, the contradictions in orders, the moments when punishment arrived late or not at all. This did not inspire hope. It inspired calculation. A system that hesitated could be endured differently than one that moved with certainty. Work continued, but the rhythm faltered. Rows were completed unevenly. Output fluctuated. Brewer responded with demands for stricter reporting. Longer hours, harsher correction. Each command arrived slightly too late to correct the previous failure. Pressure increased without restoring precision. The machine no longer responded cleanly. Brewer's health deteriorated in visible stages. His handwriting grew cramped and unsteady. He began to pause mid-sentence, searching for breath. Meals lost their appeal. Sleep fractured into shallow intervals broken by pain and anxiety. He hid these changes carefully, ashamed of them in a way he had never been ashamed of cruelty. Doctors were summoned reluctantly and dismissed quickly. Their advice sounded too much like mercy. Doctors were summoned reluctantly and dismissed quickly. Their advice sounded too much like mercy, rest, reduction, adjustment. Brewer rejected these suggestions outright. He had spent years teaching himself that rest weakened discipline. Accepting it now felt like betrayal, not just of his methods, but of his identity. As Brewer weakened, the plantation grew harsher. Overseers compensated for uncertainty with speed and punishment. Men were pushed without rhythm, without consistency. Exhaustion deepened into something chaotic. Collapses became unpredictable. The predictability Brewer had prized above all else vanished, replaced by a constant state of crisis management. Replacement slowed. Traders hesitated. Rumors had sharpened into warnings. Prices rose. Quality declined. Brewer responded by working men harder, extending hours further, compressing rest to nothing. The logic remained the same. If output fell, pressure must increase. He did not consider that pressure was now the cause, rather than the cure. One afternoon, Brewer attempted to assert authority directly. He walked into the fields unannounced. Determined to remind everyone that control still belonged to him, he managed only a short distance before dizziness forced him to stop. Men watched quietly as he steadied himself against a post. No one moved to help. No one was punished for watching. The moment passed without comment, but it lingered. Authority, once absolute, had been seen to falter. Brewer felt the humiliation burn deeper than any physical pain. He returned to the house furious, not at the men, but at his own body for failing to perform. From that day on, Brewer ruled almost entirely from inside. Orders multiplied. Letters were written. Reports demanded. He believed control could be preserved through documentation alone. But distance weakened enforcement. Each layer added between command and execution absorbed certainty. The men felt this erosion, not as freedom but as instability. Some worked harder, fearing unpredictability more than cruelty. Others slowed deliberately, conserving strength for a future they no longer believed would arrive. The plantation operated in a state of suspended tension, neither efficient nor merciful, just relentless. Brewer's nights became unbearable. Pain settled into his chest and joints. Breath came shallow and uneven. He lay awake replaying numbers, recalculating losses, convincing himself that discipline could still restore order. He refused to acknowledge the simplest truth. He was experiencing the same process he had engineered daily. Decline without relief. Neighbors began to distance themselves. Visits became rare. Invitations stopped. Brewer noticed and resented it. Respect, he realized too late, had been tied to performance. As performance declined, so did loyalty. The system he had trusted others to honor existed only as long as it produced benefit. In the fields, death lost any remaining novelty. Bodies failed and were removed without ceremony. Replacement lagged. Rows went unfinished. Brewer issued harsher directives, but enforcement could not match expectation. The plantation no longer inspired fear. It inspired exhaustion in everyone connected to it. Late in the year, Brewer suffered a collapse of his own. Not dramatic, not public. He simply could not rise one morning. Pain locked his body in place. Breath came in shallow bursts. Servants waited, uncertain. A doctor was called despite his protests. The verdict was not sudden illness, but cumulative damage. Years of strain, neglect, refusal to rest. Brewer listened in silence. He rejected nothing aloud, but he accepted nothing either. Recovery, the doctor said, would require time and restraint. Brewer dismissed him with a nod and lay back, staring at the ceiling. Time and restraint were concepts he had spent his life erasing. As winter settled in, the plantation slowed despite his orders. Weather forced pauses that discipline could not override. Brewer felt rage at the delay, then fear. Slowing revealed weakness. Weakness invited scrutiny. He realized too late that the machine depended on his illusion of invulnerability. For the first time, Brewer considered the possibility that his system might outlast him without honoring him, that it might collapse into chaos once he was gone. This thought disturbed him deeply. He had built everything to prove permanence. To be forgotten or replaced felt worse than death. What he did not yet understand was that the reckoning he feared was not future tense. It had already arrived. His body was now subject to the same rules he had enforced relentlessly. No mercy, no pause, no exemption. The punishment was not sudden. It was the slow realization that there would be no recovery. Only continuation until collapse. By the time Winter returned to Mississippi, the plantation no longer sounded alive. It did not hum the way it once had, with tools striking earth and voices moving across the fields. What remained was quieter, heavier, as if the land itself had learned to hold its breath. The man who owned it all noticed the silence before he understood it. He told himself it was efficiency, proof that he had worked the disorder out of his property. But silence born of fear is not the same as order, and even he, stubborn and slow to doubt himself, could feel the difference pressing in on his chest. His body had begun to betray him. The same hands that once signed bills of sale without hesitation now shook when he lifted a cup. His legs stiffened in the mornings, forcing him to sit on the edge of the bed longer than he liked, waiting for pain to loosen its grip. He hated these moments of weakness more than any loss of money. They reminded him that time did not respect ownership. No matter how many men he had bought, no matter how many backs he had bent until they collapsed, he could not purchase distance from the end that waited for him. The overseers noticed the change before he admitted it to himself. They saw the way he leaned heavier on his cane, the way he paused mid-step, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Some grew crueler, sensing that authority was no longer enforced by the same strength. Others grew careless, assuming the old man's eyes no longer saw everything. Both were wrong. He saw enough. He always had. Cruelty had sharpened his attention, not dulled it. Yet something had shifted beyond his control. The enslaved men and women moved differently now. Slower, yes, but also with a strange restraint, as if they were conserving something he could not reach. They did their work because punishment still followed refusal, but their obedience was hollow. He could feel it. They no longer reacted to his presence with the same urgency. Fear remained, but it had thinned, stretched by exhaustion into something quieter and more dangerous: indifference. The first collapse that winter happened in the cotton house. A man he barely remembered purchasing years earlier fell forward without a sound, his body folding in on itself, as if released from a long-held tension. The overseer kicked him, shouted, tried to pull him upright. There was no response. The man's eyes were open, fixed on nothing. When the doctor came, summoned more out of habit than concern, he did not stay long. He said what everyone already knew. The body had been spent. There was nothing left to take from it. The owner watched as the body was carried away. He felt irritation first, then calculation. A dead man did not pick cotton. A dead man represented lost labor, wasted investment. He asked how long it would take to replace him, what price the traders were asking now. But the doctor lingered longer than expected, his expression uneasy. He spoke of lungs ruined by dust, of joints ground down by years of strain, of hearts that simply stopped under the weight they had been forced to carry. He did not accuse. He did not need to. The truth sat between them, heavy and unmovable. That night the owner did not sleep well. He dreamed of fields that never ended, of rows that stretched beyond sight. In the dream he was walking among them, calling out orders, but no one turned to listen. The bodies lay everywhere, unmoving, their faces turned away from him. He woke with his heart racing, his chest tight, his sheets damp with sweat. He told himself it was nothing. Old men dreamed strange things. Fear crept in only when weakness was allowed to speak. But weakness had found its voice. Over the following months, illness spread through the quarters. Coughs that never healed, fevers that returned again and again, backs that refused to straighten after years bent low. The owner responded the only way he knew how. He increased pressure. He shortened rest. He punished delays. He believed truly that force could still bend the world back into the shape he wanted. When production dipped, he blamed laziness. When bodies failed, he blamed poor stock. He never blamed himself. That would have required a kind of honesty he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Then his own health faltered in a way he could not ignore. One morning, halfway through his routine inspection, pain lanced through his chest so sharply he dropped his cane. The world narrowed, sounds fading into a dull roar. He was helped back to the house by men he owned, their hands steady, their faces unreadable. For the first time he was carried, his weight dependent on bodies he had spent decades breaking. The irony did not occur to him in that moment. All he felt was terror. The doctor returned, this time with a seriousness that could not be dismissed. He spoke of rest, of moderation, of the dangers of exertion. The owner listened, nodding, but his mind rebelled. Rest was for people who could afford it. Moderation was a luxury. He had built his life on excess, on taking more than was given, on believing that limits were for other men. To accept the doctor's words would have been to admit that his body, like the bodies he had used, had limits too. As weeks passed, his world shrank. He no longer rode the fields daily. Reports came to him instead, filtered through overseers, who softened some truths and exaggerated others. He noticed discrepancies, numbers that did not align, excuses that repeated themselves. Control, once absolute, now slipped through his fingers. He tried to tighten his grip, but it only revealed how weak his hold had become. At night, alone in the big house, memories surfaced uninvited. Faces he had never bothered to remember appeared with sudden clarity. Men who had begged for rest, women who had collapsed under loads meant for two people. He had dismissed them all as necessary losses, the cost of doing business. Now they returned without permission, crowding his thoughts. He did not feel remorse in the way preachers described it. What he felt was something colder and more unsettling: recognition. He began to see a pattern he had refused to acknowledge. Every gain he had taken had demanded something in return. Every year of profit had been paid for in flesh and breath. He had believed the payment ended with them. He was wrong. The bill had simply been delayed. When the final reckoning came, it did not arrive with drama. It came quietly in the form of a letter. A distant relative, sensing opportunity, challenged the structure of his estate, questioning debts, ownership claims, the legality of certain transactions. Lawyers became regular visitors. Papers piled up. The owner tried to follow the arguments, but fatigue dulled his focus. Each meeting left him more exhausted than the last. The empire he had built, with such certainty, began to unravel not through rebellion or fire, but through time and decay. The enslaved people noticed the changes long before he did. Overseers were replaced. Rules shifted. Punishments became inconsistent. The machine that had once ground them down with relentless efficiency sputtered. It did not stop, but it weakened. And in that weakening, something else grew: patience. The owner spent his final months confined to a chair by the window. From there, he could see part of the land he had ruled. The fields looked smaller now, or perhaps he was simply seeing them without the illusion of control. He listened to the wind move through the cotton and wondered, for the first time, what remained of a man when power was stripped away. On the day he died, there was no great gathering, no dramatic final words. He simply stopped breathing. The body that had once commanded so many others failed in the same quiet way theirs had. When the news reached the quarters, there was no celebration. There was no open mourning either. Life continued. Work resumed. The difference was subtle but profound. The fear that had defined their days loosened its grip. He had lived long enough to understand what he had done, not in the language of confession or apology, but in consequence. His wealth could not follow him. His authority could not protect him. In the end, he was reduced to the same fragile condition as the men he had bought and broken. The punishment was not fire or chains or judgment spoken aloud. It was clarity, arriving too late to change anything. If this story held you until the end, you already understand why it was told slowly. These are not stories about the past alone. They are about what power does when it is never questioned, and what time eventually takes back. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Long, patient, and honest about what cruelty leaves behind.